Please welcome to the stage Manager, Senior Energy Industry Analyst for CFC, Miss Alisha Pinto.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. I am really happy and I feel very privileged to be here today. This is my first time talking to the electric cooperatives of Ohio. So thank you so much for welcoming me. I know that we have the privilege, I'm from CFC, which is the financier to the cooperatives, and we have the privilege of having one of your very own on our board. So it's great to be here and share what's happening in the nuclear energy space. We have 50 minutes, and over the next 50 minutes, once I figure out how to use this. Oh, there we go. Over the next, yeah, there you have it. Over the next 50 minutes, we'll talk about the nuclear energy landscape. I wanted to share with you what's happening. There have been a lot of announcements in the news if you're following the press releases. There's a lot of excitement. But what I want to do is really separate some of the promises that have been made from what the reality is on the ground. And we'll talk through what's happening today, what's driving this new excitement around nuclear energy when it comes to the higher levels of demand across the sector. We're seeing changes in policy along with it, as well as private sector investment. We'll talk through some of the new projects that are coming online, or not coming online, but are being presented as viable options, as well as talk about some of the challenges that are going to be in the way of getting all these projects to scale to deployment. And then finally, I'll wrap up with talking about what we can learn, what questions you as co-op leaders need to keep in mind as you think through nuclear energy and as a future for your service territories, and how we need to look at it as we go forward. So before we get into what the future holds, let's talk about what's happening here today. We have about 96 reactors across the country. This provides about 17% of power generation in the US. When it comes to the co-op network, about 2/3 of electric cooperatives have some nuclear energy in their generation portfolios. And this amounts to about 15% of the electricity that's delivered to electric cooperatives. You can see where the nuclear reactors are located on the map here. What's really exciting to know is the newest nuclear reactor has been located in co-op service territory. So you might have heard of Vogtle 3 and 4 coming online a couple of years ago. That's in Georgia. And it was the latest example of having a conventional large nuclear reactor on the grid. But that comes with some learnings as well. One is the cost of bringing that reactor online, bring those reactors online, but also the timelines. And that's what we need to keep in mind as we go forward with thinking about the nuclear energy industry and where we are. So today's nuclear energy resurgence is really driven by three forces. And these are the three forces that you might have heard of throughout the day today, maybe over the past few months. One is electricity demand. Electricity demand over the past 2 decades has been relatively flat, below 1%. But over the last decade or so, the last few years, we've heard of increased demand. Now that's being driven by data centers. You might have heard a lot of data center talk today. We're seeing a reshoring of manufacturing, industrialization, as well as the electrification of heating systems. And so that's all leading to a rise in electricity demand, higher levels of load coming on the grid. The policy setting is another area that's really driving this resurgence. Government incentives, programs driven by the governments to ensure energy security is helping to bring together this ecosystem that's needed to advance nuclear energy. And then the third piece of the puzzle, which we haven't seen in a long time, is capital. We're seeing private investment, private equity, venture capital coming in to really drive the market to commercialization. And that's an important part of the discussion because the sector has been slow and it has had capital, but it's really ramping up now. So let's first talk about electricity demand and where that growth area is. Over 50% of the growth over the next decade is supposed to be coming from data centers. The rise in artificial intelligence is leading to this growth in electricity demand. Now, my office is located in Northern Virginia, which is known as Data Center Alley. But what we're seeing is that the prediction is that these markets in Northern Virginia will be saturated, and the markets are going to be growing across different parts of the country, closer to urban areas. So Texas, you see Dallas or Phoenix. Also here in Ohio, the estimates are that that's going to be about 4.5 gigawatts of electricity from data centers in the state. We're also seeing the IOUs invest in a lot of money in the infrastructure. So we're not only, this demand is also driving capital. One of the estimates is that IOUs are going to invest about $1.1 trillion over the next decade. So when that comes to generation and how that's going to pan out, there is the hyperscalers and the data center developers are looking towards nuclear energy because they require firm source of power. They require reliable 24/7 power supply. And nuclear energy is set to provide that baseload power. What you see on the screen here is announcements for a wide variety of nuclear reactors over, this is from 2024, but since then there have been a lot more announcements. So we have a really broad pipeline of potential projects that are coming out. And this is a very strong signal to the market and to our understanding of where the potential growth can occur. In Ohio itself, you can see that there are 2 projects. I think there was a third that was announced pretty recently. So with those announcements, what we're also seeing is an overlap between where nuclear projects are coming about, as well as where hyperscale data centers are also popping up. So your hyperscalers are your big tech companies, Meta, Amazon, Google, Apple, and they are following the nuclear energy resurgence as well. There's been a lot of interest, a lot of investment by hyperscalers in nuclear energy. For example, 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, that's going to be restarted, and there's a partnership between Constellation Energy and Microsoft as an off-taker of that energy. So this is really important in the larger discussion of the direction of nuclear energy because hyperscalers are also interested in the sector. So nuclear energy investments from the private sector have been pretty slow. Over the last few years, and you can see this growth, private sector investments has really ramped up. Since 2020, growth has increased exponentially in various companies. And what it indicates is that the market and investors are interested in taking a chance on nuclear energy projects. They're seeing potential for a dependable pipeline of projects, of available power in the future. Just last year, in 2025, we had about $2 billion in investments in the nuclear energy sector. And this is startup financing, different series of early private sector financing. The biggest buckets on your screen are X-Energy and TerraPower. And we'll talk about those project profiles later on in the presentation. But what's interesting to know is that, for example, X-Energy issued an IPO. The issuance was higher than they expected. We also have other nuclear energy companies that are getting into SPACs to get onto the public market. So the public market is seeing potential in investing in nuclear energy, and that there's potential in the long term. Maybe it's not at the stage of commercialization at the moment, but there is a possibility in the future. Let's come a little closer to home. You are more familiar with what's happening in Ohio than I am, but I know that there are lots of changes at the state level. There have been a lot of announcements. Some co-ops are closer to some of those locations. And I was talking to some folks who are close to Pinkerton. And there's both nuclear SMRs that are coming to the state, but also nuclear fuel production. And that's a very important piece of the puzzle. So for co-ops in Ohio, you're going to be very close to some of the action. It really reflects what's happening at the national level as well. All right, so we've talked about where we were, or where we are currently. Let's talk about what this technology landscape looks like. What do we mean when we talk about advanced nuclear reactors? And most people think of SMRs, which are small modular reactors, but they're also microreactors, and we'll go through those briefly today. But I think it's really important to think of SMRs not as one particular technology. There's no single technology. There are different kinds of technologies, reactors, safety systems that are coming online. And what we're going to watch for is which ones are going to make it to deployment, which ones are going to advance along the way. And just a step back, when you talk about nuclear energy, we're usually talking about what's on the right here, conventional nuclear energy. These are really large-scale reactors. They provide firm baseload power to our systems. This technology is familiar to a lot of people, and it's currently what's running across the US. Small modular reactors, their size, given the name, it's smaller, so it's between 20 to 400 megawatts. They offer operational flexibility for utilities. And they also have new systems of cooling their systems. And one of the biggest positive points of value proposition is that they can be built in a factory, and they could be replicated more easily than the conventional custom-built in-place nuclear reactors that you're familiar with at the moment. There is potential for bringing down the costs and lower financing in the future. But what we currently have today is we're going to see are all first-of-a-kind projects. So these projects are going to be more expensive than what could come down the line in another decade or so. And then the third category are microreactors. These are much smaller, between 1 to 20 megawatts. Their applications are quite different from SMRs. We'll look at their used, the biggest use case is in military bases, in very remote communities. They're used for resilience and reliable power. We're able to transport these microreactors. So they provide a different business case. And also, we'll see in a little while, even with SMRs, each of them provide different business cases. So they're not necessarily all competitors trying to replace baseload power, but they provide different options. So let's start with small modular reactors and talk through what that value proposition is. We see that with SMRs, they have the ability to both provide fast installation, for example. You're able to build them in a factory and increase that size over time. So for example, if you need nuclear energy from a conventional resource, you're using large areas of land, first of all, but also you're building very large sizes of reactors where you may not need all that energy at one go, whereas with SMRs, you can build or you can add modules over time to grow into that load or that demand that's needed. They have a much smaller footprint. For example, a conventional reactor would need about 3,500 acres, whereas an SMR requires up to 35 acres or so. There are many different types of designs, and we'll go through that. There's not a single technology. We have globally 75 different types of designs, and one can only predict that maybe in the next few years, with a lot of the capital and excitement around SMRs, there might be more designs. There hasn't really been a leader just yet in these technologies. So we have different kinds of cooling systems. We have water-cooled molten salt. We have gas-cooled systems. And these provide different options, different innovations, as well as competitions. Competition among the reactor designers, among the companies that are coming forward. So really, time will tell when we go through licensing, construction, and deployment, who are the winners. And with all these different designs, at the moment, we have just a few select companies, select projects that have been provided a lot more financing and opportunity to move ahead. So what benefits can we see? We've talked about some of this. Let's go through it all. The first is, compared to conventional reactors, the value proposition from SMRs is that they have new and improved safety features. So they have a passive safety system that allows for higher levels of safety going forward. They're also, as I said, modular. So they're built in smaller reactor sizes. They can be added on, expanded over time. They have a much smaller footprint, so the infrastructure required is a lot less rigorous than it does for your conventional reactors. And then the fuel that's used in SMRs is slightly different. You don't refuel as often as conventional reactors. You refuel every 3 to 7 years. So SMRs are not necessarily unique to the US, but the good news is that the US is really far ahead when it comes to advancing this technology. But it remains fragmented. We're seeing different countries Canada, the UK, Russia, China, all have some SMRs in their pipeline. And there'll be different ways and unique pathways to advance these. And all these companies will have to go through different test rounds of safety, of licensing, of deployment, construction. And I think we'd see in the next few years who comes out ahead, and that would really drive the pathway forward. This gives you an idea of what the options are in North America, the different potential projects. And most of them are pipeline projects that we're seeing. Some of them are in Canada, but a majority, as I mentioned, are here in the United States. And it's worth watching to see how all these three forces come together over the next few years to go from being potential projects to being deployable, continuing with that financing capability. So let's talk about some of the projects. Which of these technologies can be deployed at scale over the next few years? Before we get into the details of the projects, I want to first go through this concept of first of a kind. I know it's a little bit hard to read, but bear with me. I'll explain it to you. First of a kind really refers to that innovation, the idea of taking projects that are new and testing them, going through the engineering processes. They might see failure, so learning through those different steps of the way with the supply chain issues, with workforce development, and coming together to deploy these projects. But the thing with first of a kind is that they're usually very expensive, and they also take a long time to build and develop. So the question for these 5 projects that we'll go through is not whether they can be cost effective, because we know that they're going to be expensive. But the question really is, are they able to go through those first of a kind, or the first projects? Are they able to replicate themselves? Can they bring down the costs over the next few years, over the next few project deployments? So let's talk about one of the most advanced ones. This is TerraPower. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. TerraPower is owned, has funding from Microsoft and Bill Gates. What's unique about it is that it uses new technology. It's the sodium-cooled reactors, and it pairs with storage. So under regular or normal hours, it can produce about 345 megawatts. But then during peak hours, it's able to go up to about 500 megawatts. So really, it underscores this idea of operational flexibility that comes with SMRs, where you're able to have changes in your operation depending on the needs. It's one of the more advanced technologies because NRC recently issued its construction permit. And so what I would be watching for with TerraPower is whether they can demonstrate a predictable construction timeline and deployment. Are they able to go through the next few steps in the process to become viable? The next one is TVA. This one is probably closer to home for a lot of you. We have electric co-ops that are served by TVA, and they're using the GE Hitachi technology. This is similar to technology that's being used in Ontario, Canada, to build their first SMRs. So a lot of the lessons learned from Canada can be applied in Tennessee for their project. It uses light water reactors, and this is technology that there is past operational experience. So the hope is that it's a lower risk pathway to demonstrating that SMRs can be deployed and replicated. They're under NRC review at the moment, and the potential commercial operations are supposed to start around in the 2030s. I think the interesting thing with TVA is that it has a history of having a lot of nuclear generation. And so what would be really interesting to watch is how it's able to tap into that workforce, tap into the engineers they have to really run their program successfully. And that could help demonstrate wider implications for the industry. Next is X-Energy. This is another very interesting business case. This is one of the companies that went public not too long ago. They've raised a lot of funding. But their business case is different from the other two we've heard of. They've partnered with Dow Corporation, and they're building their project out in Texas to provide both electricity as well as industrial heating. So it is twofold in its potential to serve not only electricity needs, but other industrial and manufacturing applications as well. And so when I say that there's not one technology, I think we need to keep in mind that advanced nuclear can play many different roles, and it would be really interesting to see how each of these roles develop and the business cases for them develop over time. They've also received significant funding from the DOE, which has allowed them to progress. Their technology is unique in that it uses gas-cooled reactors, and the current project is supposed to be about 320 megawatts. Now, our fourth reactor is part of Holtec's project in Michigan. It's going to be located on the same property as Palisades out in Michigan, and that's another co-op connection over here, where the restart of Palisades has provided some co-ops with additional energy. They're using conventional pressurized water reactors that's similar to technology that they already have, and they're trying to develop this technology so it lowers the risk of new pathways, new technology pathways. So there's a familiarity among the nuclear industry, but also among regulators and utilities. But that does not preclude operational and regulatory risks. They'll still have to go through the steps that other projects need to go through. And they'll still have to navigate all the financing, the licensing, permitting, and construction project processes. So this would be another interesting project to look out for, because it's using familiar technology, but deploying it in a different way. And then the last project I want to talk about is actually a microreactor, and we'll come to microreactors in a little while in the presentation. But this is interesting because it's under the DOE's reactor pilot program. So the Department of Energy at the federal level is helping companies test out different projects. It's in collaboration with the Idaho National Lab. The size of the reactor is much smaller than the other ones that I profiled. It's about 15 megawatts, with the potential of these microreactors to go up to 75 megawatts. It uses sodium it's cooled using sodium, but it also uses HALEU, which is a different kind of nuclear fuel for their fuel production. What would be interesting with this demonstration is that we can see how it can be deployed for resiliency, resource adequacy, and energy security applications. So potentially for the military or in remote communities. So what have we learned from the first 5 projects that are kind of the leaders of the pack so far? Right now, we don't have a clear winner. There are many different kinds of technologies. There are different ways of cooling, safety, fuel, various customer bases, as well as different pathways forward. Most of the timelines that we see are between early to mid-2030s. So that gives us almost 5 years to a decade to see these projects go from demonstration as a project to construction and then deployment. They're all first of a kind, which means the costs are going to be higher, and those costs also remain uncertain. I think the example of NuScale goes to show that costs also increase over time, especially if there are delays in project timelines. Finally, to be successful, we need that environment that provides very strategic customers. You have an order book that's ready. You have a design that's easy to replicate, and you have the capacity, the supply chain capacity, the manufacturing capacity to bring it forward. And those are all really important for success going forward. So we've talked about some of the opportunities in the nuclear energy sector. And I think it's really important to look at what's happening at the policy level, because a lot of the, historically, a lot of the progress when it comes to nuclear energy has been because of federal policy. So it's been driven by financing from the federal government, and that's pushed nuclear energy forward. Whereas today, as I showed you earlier in the presentation, you have the private sector that's come in to play a role, and it shows you that we can go from the ideas, the technology, to commercialization, and there's a certain amount of bankability. But the federal government is still playing a role in several different ways. It's able to play a role and come in to bring in the scale that's needed. It's also coming in to show that they can reduce deployment risks so that commercial investors can take a lead role in financing some of these projects. So we've moved from basic research to now commercialization. And one of the biggest funding programs is what was announced recently. It's the 2020, in 2026, it was the supply chain loans. So this was a funding pot of about $17.5 billion. It went to 5 projects. Each of them had 2 reactors of 1.1 gigawatts each, so a total of 11 gigawatt potential projects. And where that scale comes in is that they're using the AP1000 Westinghouse design to bring in kind of a standardization in deployment. So all the 5 projects, the 10 reactors, will use the same design and be able to have an order book for the manufacturing of components over the next decade, so that we reduce the time in producing and manufacturing those components by several years. So the idea is to be able to scale up with what's known and have designs that can be replicated very easily. One of the biggest challenges with conventional reactor designs is that it takes a long time to build these very precision forward components that are required for the reactors. So the hope is that you build up the supply chain, the value chain all along the way, and the manufacturers can expand their capacity as well. The second is that the federal support is also going towards reducing this early deployment risk or the development risk. There are several different projects and programs that DOE has launched in the past few years that are trying to reduce this first-of-a-kind deployment risk, whether it's testing new technology, getting it to pass the different rounds of tests, because with the NRC, with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, you have to go through several different stages. So by working together, collaborating and partnering with various national labs, they can test the projects. There was also an advanced reactor program which provided about $160 million to several reactors to advance. I think the main takeaway from all this is that there is policy support coming on different fronts. And we're seeing that federal policy is hoping to solve several different challenges. First is licensing. The licensing process is said to be very cumbersome, and the government is now trying to reduce some of that burden and the red tape, reduce the risk of prolonged timelines, make regulatory pathways very predictable for the companies that are involved. We have, in the news, we've heard that NRC is modifying some of its efforts. They're trying to make it a little easier. But that comes with some challenges, because some of the folks who don't agree with the changes say that safety could be compromised. The other part is that they're providing financing, and that's an important part. They're providing loan guarantees. They're providing that first level of upfront financing to crowd in commercial investors in the space. And then finally, on the supply chain, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but there has been quite a few announcements recently where the government's supporting mining, drilling, the production process of enriching uranium, and also workforce development. So all these three together provide that basis for which the private sector can come in, as well as demand for the nuclear reactors. So we've gone through some of the big picture items on what the reactor designs are, the opportunities, some of the licensing. I want to kind of step back, go on a slight little tangent and talk about microreactors, because this is another piece of the puzzle. It doesn't get as much attention because really the market for microreactors is even newer than it is for SMRs. And the use case is, the business cases are also very niche. So what we're seeing is that they're much smaller. And so the question is, will they be financially viable? And what's that time frame to get them to that level of cost savings? The main model is that microreactors can be developed in a factory and then transported. So they could be fully developed and then shipped to the site. This picture on the top is supposed to give you a frame of reference of how big they are, where they can fit in the back of a truck and be shipped on site. They're small, as the name suggests, between 1 to 20 megawatts. It could go up to 75 megawatts, depending on the design. But they're really designed to be transported, and also they're self-contained. So they don't need a lot of infrastructure when they're built in their location. They have passive features, passive safety features, and so they won't need constant monitoring. But they're also pretty versatile in what they can be used for. And the main value proposition here is resiliency, reliability, and that energy security. And we'll see why. The main players in this field are, it's a bit fragmented, but you have the national labs, you have universities, and you have the military as really the top 3 main groups of players. But it's still a fragmented field, and we're still not close to commercialization because it's really at the early stages. What we'd probably be seeing is that there'll be competition with SMRs for capital, for different kinds of funding, for the regulatory process that's needed, for the manufacturing capacity and scale. So there's a lot to watch out for in this area. Some of the initial sites are at military bases. I said this before. And so we're seeing the Department of Defense, Department of War, really taking the lead in pushing this technology forward. And it's because it has these unique components of resiliency, of energy security that's needed by the military. So they need 24 reliable energy supply, regardless of weather, regardless of fuel shortages, or any grid failures. They'd want to be kept on, the bases need to be on all the time. And once they reach commercialization, once they reach deployment in the military space, we would see that coming into the commercial space as well over time. Microreactors will face similar challenges as with SMRs. They're really high initial costs. There are questions around public sentiment, and that's going to be the case of SMRs as well. What's going to happen with waste management? Is there a process to deal with waste management? And the regulatory framework currently is set out for conventional nuclear reactors, maybe even SMRs now that it's evolving. But what happens when we bring microreactors into the game? OK, I know I have a few more minutes left, so let's go through some of the challenges, and then I'll wrap up. I know I'm between you and getting home. So we have 3 key bottlenecks that I want to talk about. The first is timing. I've said this a lot already. Timing is going to be a challenge. The second is the fuel supply chain. And then the third is going to be industrial capacity. Are we going to be able to manufacture what's needed? And really, it's not about just having an innovative design, and this design is going to take us through. It's about the ecosystem that comes with that innovative design. So data centers and hyperscalers, which is the biggest bet on nuclear, they take 18 to 24 months to build. Solar and storage takes about 2 years. Combined cycle natural gas, maybe 3 years. That's probably stretched longer with this large gas turbine, the long lead times for turbines. Historically, this is the time frame for nuclear energy, 6 to 15 years. That's the historic. Now, the current projects, they say that they can be faster, but this is something that we'd be watching for. How can these projects go from first of a kind, early deployment to then become, to then repeat that process and scale up. The second challenge is the fuel supply bottleneck. I think you heard about this earlier today. We import about 95% of our uranium for commercial power plants. Our biggest importers are Canada, Russia, Kazakhstan, and Australia. There was, over the past few years, the government put a ban on imports from Russia. And at the same time, they're helping to build up our fuel mining as well as production process in the US. So this is another area that we'd be watching for to see what happens over the next few years. One other point I want to bring up here is HALEU, which is this, it's the high assay, low enriched uranium that's required for advanced nuclear reactors, especially SMRs, and that's not produced in the US at scale yet. So it's going to be tough to have deployment and then at scale deployment if you don't have the fuel supply chain to support that deployment. So it's an energy security issue as well as a deployment risk. And then the third part is the production process. Both for mining, drilling, and processing, we have some production that's happening in the country, mostly in Texas, Wyoming, but it's expanding. But how quickly can it expand? And is it able to expand along with the development in the nuclear reactor space? There's $2.7 billion from DOE to support this expansion. So we're going to be waiting to see how that evolves. So what's needed to move forward? We talked about the technologies, finding winners among those technologies. There are different kinds of reactor configurations. But we also need not just the technology, but the ecosystem that comes with it. The regulatory ecosystem, the financing ecosystem, the supply chain, the fuel supply chain as well. So two last slides I want to leave you with before I run out of time. My main story today here is that advanced nuclear, SMRs, and microreactors, they're really they're a long-term planning consideration for electric co-ops. We don't see them necessarily as a silver bullet in the short term for addressing load growth. But that being said, we see that the momentum is real. We're seeing all the progress that's happening. But there are first-of-a-kind challenges, especially on the costs and the timelines. We don't know which technology will win. There are so many technologies out there. There will be winners, there will be losers. It's hard to predict just yet which ones are the winners. What we'd be watching for are projects related to the military when it comes to microreactors, industrial projects, as well as the hyperscaler projects. And then a few questions that I'm going to leave you with, and our team will be watching for over the next few years. One is, which reactor and which project will be first to reach construction and deployment? Do we have costs that are reducing significantly after that first deployment? Can the US scale its fuel production? What will the financing and investment landscape look like in the next few years? Can it be sustained over the next few years when these projects start coming online? And then for co-ops, co-op leaders such as yourself, I think it's important to know that today's problems are really important to solve, and we have a lot of challenges. And nuclear energy and advanced nuclear reactors are going to be part of that solution in the years to come. So I'll end with that. Thank you very much. I appreciate you having me here and happy to take any questions before I hand it over. Yes?
How big is the risk that, given the next two elections, if they go, depending on how the next two elections go, how serious is the risk that we could go back to where we were a few years ago and this basically go back to ground zero?
I think I'm an optimist on the nuclear energy sector when it comes to pathways to advance. What we've seen is that a lot of the programs that the federal government put into place was started under the Biden administration, and now it's ramped up under the Trump administration. So I think there's a clear pathway. There's agreement on both sides of the aisle that nuclear energy is really important for our progress as a country, for advancement. It's really cutting edge technology that we're hoping to take forward in the years to come. So I think, I'm optimistic that it would sustain over the next couple of election cycles. All right, thank you for having me.